This case takes us to Cairnbrook, Pennsylvania on September 19th, 1999. There was a group of 3 girls, all of whom were minors, walking through their neighborhood. The 3 were just chatting and joking around with each other as cars passed by them. Then, one of these vehicles pulls up right next to the group and stops. One of the girls immediately noticed that this exact car had just passed them a couple of times already. The car itself was very easy to spot as it was a teal colored Geo Metro. A man stepped out of it and turned towards the girls, glaring at them menacingly. The girl stared back at the man for several seconds that felt more like minutes. Then the man opened his mouth and asked a question. Right as one of the girls was getting ready to answer, the man reached out his arms and hugged the girl tight before tossing her into his car through the driver's side door. The girl screamed as the man leaped back inside and sped off with one of them. The other 2 ran back home to tell an adult what had just happened. Police promptly began their investigation, asking the girls what the man looked like. The girl said that the guy was white and tall, about 6 feet or more. He was also on the more lanky side. Obviously, this description wasn't exactly the best, but it's all the girls could muster as they tried to process the traumatic event. The sketch you see on screen right now is the first iteration of the kidnapper. The downright creepy nature of this sketch has made it so popular outside of crime to the point where it's probably more well known in niche horror media rather than for the actual criminal. The girl that had just been abducted was 10 years old, and I will be referring to her as Jane just as a placeholder name. As the unknown man drove off with Jane, he had a firearm pointed at her. The guy told Jane to keep quiet and be still, but the 10-year-old was understandably freaking out and couldn't understand his requests. Jane thrashed around, screaming at the top of her lungs, which caused the abductor to briefly pull over and hit the girl to get her to calm down. The drive continued into West Virginia, where the man eagerly looked left and right, searching for a secluded area. Eventually, he found a location he was content with and pulled over. He then turned towards Jane and her. Once he was done with his despicable and disgusting act, he tossed a paper bag and a napkin to Jane, telling her to clean up. Now, while this crime is a total nightmare, it could have gotten so much worse for Jane. The man started his car back up and Jane was now scared that she was gonna die. But instead, the guy drove back towards Pennsylvania, and as soon as he crossed state lines, he ditched the victim on the road. He bellowed from the car window for the girl to stay there and count to 100 before searching for help. So after the man had left and some time had passed, another car was seen approaching and spotted the distressed girl crying all alone. The driver got out and asked what's going on and where the girl's parents were. Jane tried her best to describe what had just happened to her, and immediately the adult knew that this girl was an unfortunate victim. The adult called police, who then proceeded to collect DNA evidence. Along with bodily fluids, there were partial prints that were believed to belong to the rapist. However, officials struggled to find an identity to tie the DNA to. The FBI lab was able to generate an adequate DNA profile, but they couldn't match it up with anything in the DNA index system database. The case went cold for several years until 2004. In April of that year, the FBI lab shared a DNA profile that was created from evidence found in a different kidnapping / case of a different girl. This other incident had occurred back in September of 1988 in Hagerstown, Maryland, over a decade before Jane's case. The two DNA profiles were a perfect match, but yet investigators were still unable to find an actual identity. Towards the latter half of 2018, those partial prints I mentioned earlier were passed through the next generation ID system once more, and this time officials got a hit. This potential match was a man named Timothy David Nelson. Investigators dug deeper into Timothy's family, and after extensive research, they were able to match up the partial prints they had to Timothy's son, Timothy Nelson Jr. At the time of the discovery, Timothy Jr. was living in Maryland. An arrest warrant was issued in January of 2019 for Timothy Jr. So finally, over 2 decades, or rather over 3 decades for that first victim, the culprit was finally caught. For the kidnapping and assault on Jane, Timothy received a sentence of 30 years in prison. In the 1980s to 1990s, Melbourne, Victoria was plagued by a series of attacks conducted by an unidentified man now infamously known as Mr. Cruel, or Australia's boogeyman. He is responsible for attacking at least 4 girls, with one of them, Carmen Chan, even being murdered. In the early hours of Saturday, August 22nd, 1987, specifically 4 a.m., a masked man was on the prowl, stalking a particular family. This family lived within Lower Plenty, which is a suburb of Melbourne. After approaching the family's home, the intruder skillfully removed a pane from the living room window, slipping into the home undetected. Equipped with a knife and a gun, he confronted the parents in their bedroom, demanding that they listen to him if they didn't want to get hurt. The adults were told to lay on their stomachs as their hands and feet were tied up behind them. Investigators later shared that the specific knot that was used was often seen among sailors or people with experience out at sea. After securely binding them, the two were shoved into the closet and both blindfolded and gagged. The man now had full reign of the house and could explore at his own leisure with no worry of being stopped. He walked out of the master bedroom and towards an adjacent room that belonged to the family's 6-year-old son. The boy was also bound in the same process as his parents and then fastened to the bed. But the man's target was not the boy. Instead, the home invader continued to another bedroom belonging to the family's 11-year-old daughter. He easily overpowered the girl and proceeded to assault her for several hours, even taking breaks to make himself food using whatever the family had in the kitchen. Once the masked man was satisfied, he grabbed a box of records in the home and a jacket belonging to the father/husband and left. Authorities were later called and they really struggled to understand the crime that had just occurred. It seemed as though the home invasion was completely unprovoked, and at the time, Melbourne was described as an extremely safe place to live. Of course, it did have its fair share of crime, but nevertheless, it was less common than other places. Many residents even started calling it the most livable city in the world. When police spoke to the family's daughter, she had told them that the man called someone using the family phone. He was threatening someone on the other end, telling them to hide their children or they would be next in line to be attacked. The man even called whoever the other person was as a bozo. But contrary to what the daughter had shared, there were no calls in the records in the time period in which the masked man was inside of the home. Tactics like this, which are referred to as red herrings, will be a common trend seen with Mr. Cruel. Fast forward to December 27th, 1988, Mr. Cruel struck again. This time, the victims were the Wills family, consisting of John Wills, his wife, and their 4 daughters. Around 5:45 a.m., the entire family was asleep. Then, in his slumber, John felt a cold object meet his forehead, which jolted him awake. A man with blue overalls and a blue ski mask stood over him with a gun in hand pointed at him. The mysterious man said, "Don't be a hero." John stared at the gun, then shifted his gaze to the man's other hand, which was holding a knife. He shook his wife awake, and all the two could do was stare with their mouths agape due to shock. Just like with the previous family a year ago, John and his wife were also told to roll over on their stomachs. After gagging and tying them up in the same manner, the masked man assured the couple that he was simply there for money. From their nightstand, he took $35 before exiting the room and entering the shared bedroom of the 4 daughters. Inside, he called out one girl by name, Sharon Wills, and told her to wake up. Sharon was also tied up and blindfolded. The man then went through the closet and picked out some of Sharon's clothes, including a skirt, before leaving with Sharon. About 15 minutes later, the parents had finally undone their restraints. They rushed to the room of their daughters and realized that Sharon, their eldest, had been kidnapped. The phone lines had also been cut, so John had to run over to the neighbor's home to use their phone in order to call police. And in a desperate attempt to locate Sharon, John wandered the neighborhood, hoping that by some miracle he would find his daughter. But of course, Mr. Cruel and Sharon were long gone. But luckily for the family, Sharon was returned to them in a shocking turn of events. Just before midnight that same day, a woman was out for a walk when she noticed what looked like a small person wrapped in green bags standing on the sidewalk. The woman approached them and realized that it was a child, 10-year-old Sharon to be exact. Sharon said, "My name is Sharon Wills, and I was taken from home early this morning. A man left me here and told me to go and ring home." Police were contacted, who then reached out to Sharon's parents. Police sat Sharon down and tried to get some information out of her that would help identify the abductor. She stated that she was blindfolded for the entire day, so she didn't know where she was or what exactly the man looked like. But she did say that he was rather soft-spoken and, oddly enough, sort of kind. Which is so weird to say given the nature of the crime. Sharon specifically used the word gentle to describe Mr. Cruel. Mr. Cruel fed Sharon a Vegemite sandwich along with milk and lemonade. He had even given Sharon a bath, which authorities believed was done in order to wash away any DNA evidence. He then clipped her nails and both flossed and brushed her teeth. Police were completely dumbfounded when they listened to Sharon explain these details. Most of what she shared really didn't help much in advancing the investigation. The most valuable detail they did get was probably the sounds of aircraft that Sharon could hear when they reached their destination. As for Sharon's original clothing, they were never found. Investigators were eventually able to link Sharon's case to the one that had occurred a year ago, which weren't that far from each other in location. When this particular information was made public, the nicknames of the Hampton and the Boogeyman started to see traction. Sharon was also able to help police draw up a potential layout of Mr. Cruel's room based on what she could feel with her hands and feet. After the incident involving Sharon, Mr. Cruel took a longer break before his next attack, with this one occurring on July 3rd, 1990. This time, the target was the Linus family. The Linuses had moved to Melbourne from England for business purposes after hearing that it was one of the safest locations around. Little did they know that it was going to be in the safest place where their family would face one of the scariest moments in their lives. Brian and Rosemary Linus had left their 2 daughters, 15-year-old Fiona and 13-year-old Nicola, at home in order to attend a farewell party that was hosted for them. The family was intending to return to England soon. The girls were in their beds when, around midnight, a man had broken into the home. It was Mr. Cruel. Just like with Sharon, Mr. Cruel took some of Nicola's clothing, including her school uniform. At the same time, he was also tying Fiona to the bed. Before taking Nicola and leaving, Mr. Cruel told Fiona that her father would have to pay $25,000 in order to get Nicola back. He then carried the girl into the Linus' rental car in the driveway and drove off. Just 20 minutes after the abduction had occurred, Brian and Rosemary returned home. Immediately, they knew something had happened as their car was missing and their front door was left wide open. Brian sprinted upstairs to her daughter's room and saw Fiona all tied up, and that's when Fiona exclaimed that Nicola had been kidnapped and the masked man was requesting $25,000. When authorities arrived, Brian informed them that he had the money ready and wanted to get Nicola back as soon as possible. But unfortunately, Mr. Cruel had left no way to get in touch with him, so about a day and a half went by before any sign of Nicola was found. But the investigators' first discovery in this case would turn out to be the most important, as it was Nicola herself. She was found fully clothed and wrapped in a blanket at an electricity station near her home. According to Nicola, Mr. Cruel had dropped her off there and told her to sit there until he drove away. After a few minutes passed, Nicola removed the blindfold which had been kept on her the entire time, just like with Sharon. During Nicola's exchange with the police, she shared that she thinks the criminal was about 5 foot 8 inches tall. She was even able to provide some details regarding where Mr. Cruel lived. But the description really wasn't all that in depth, as Sharon was only able to capture a few brief glimpses from her blindfold, and there really weren't any distinguishable features in sight. Another similar detail to Sharon's case was that Nicola was also bathed. And while she was being kept at Mr. Cruel's home, or wherever the location they were at was, Nicola said that Mr. Cruel was speaking to someone. He was speaking in such a way that could be considered a full-blown conversation. However, the person that he was talking to never actually responded to him. Investigators believe that this was another of Mr. Cruel's red herrings. He may have wanted authorities to believe that there was an accomplice so that they would invest time and resources into looking for this other person. Then, months after the incident had occurred, Nicola told her parents that she remembered hearing airplanes where she was being held. Yet another similarity to Sharon's case. The fourth and probably worst case involving Mr. Cruel occurred on April 13th, 1991. The Chan family consisted of 5 people, John and Phyllis Chan along with their 3 daughters. John and Phyllis led very busy days, working about 18 hours a day to provide an above average lifestyle for their kids. The family owned 3 restaurants in Victoria along with additional investment properties. And as you would expect, the parents frequently returned home very late, oftentimes past midnight, which made the Chan family a perfect target for Mr. Cruel. So on the night of the 13th, John and Phyllis were out working like usual, leaving their daughters, the eldest of which was 13, all alone in their mansion. The primary focus of this segment will be 13-year-old Carmen. Carmen was in her room watching TV along with her 2 younger sisters, both of whom will remain unnamed. Around 9 p.m., one of the sisters said that she was hungry, so Carmen accompanied her into the kitchen to make dinner, and that's when they came face to face with Mr. Cruel, wearing a green and gray tracksuit. He uttered, "I'm only here for your money." After tying up and trapping Carmen's sisters inside of a closet, Mr. Cruel commanded Carmen to lead him to where her parents kept their cash. In the meantime, the other 2 girls were trying to break free from the restraints, and when they finally did, they realized that the closet they were in was blocked from the outside by some sort of desk or table. So by the time they were able to escape the closet, Mr. Cruel and Carmen were gone. The girls rushed to the phone and called their father, who was managing one of their restaurants. When John learned of the news, he immediately called the police. When they arrived, they saw a message scrawled onto the family's Toyota Camry. It said, "Payback Asian substance dealer. More to come." This led authorities to believe that John and Phyllis were conducting some sort of illegal activity, and this kidnapping was related to a personal quarrel. Investigators determined that the kidnapper had entered the house by cutting the screen to an unlocked window. Afterwards, he left with Carmen through the backyard door in the kitchen. Dogs were able to track Mr. Cruel's steps out by about 300 meters through the family's tennis court and garden to an empty parking lot where it is believed that Mr. Cruel hopped in a vehicle. A little over a day later, John and Phyllis hosted a press conference where they begged the public for help and the kidnapper to give Carmen back. And interestingly, a few days after Carmen's abduction, Phyllis had put out an encrypted letter in the newspaper that was meant to be seen by Carmen and her abductor. Now, keep in mind, at the time, authorities weren't 100% sure that this case was related to the previous 2 with Nicola and Sharon. but they did keep the possibility in mind. According to Phyllis, her daughter would know how to decipher her message. It mentioned that the Chans were ready to offer a large sum of money to get Carmen back safely. Carmen's sisters even added their own messages to it, saying that they missed their sister and wanted her to come back so they could help her with their schoolwork. But unlike the previous cases, Carmen was not returned. Revealed that on the night when Carmen was abducted, the crime scene had been quote-unquote destroyed. First responders had paid no mind to preserving the scene in its original state, ultimately messing up a lot of potential evidence. Since police didn't know for sure if Mr. Cruel was involved, they set their sights on people who may have had a connection to John or Phyllis Chan. Perhaps John had an enemy in business or something of that nature. However, investigators soon eliminated any possibility of this being a crime conducted by someone that the Chans knew personally. And thus they set their main focus onto Mr. Cruel and the previous cases. It was also determined that the message left on the family's vehicle was yet another red herring. In an attempt to get Carmen back unharmed, authorities offered a reward of $300,000 to any information leading to Mr. Cruel's arrest. Being that Mr. Cruel's previous victims were returned alive, the Chans and police were hopeful that the same would be done with Carmen. But little did they know they were in.
This will revolutionize your shaving routine, all thanks to Manscaped.com and their Handyman Compact Face Shaver, so you can look and feel your best in a package that fits in the palm of your hands. They've incorporated their skin-safe technology.
In store for a tragic ending. About a year after Carmen's abduction, specifically April 9th, 1992, at Eggers Creek near Thomastown, a man and his dog were out on their daily walk. At some point, the dog stopped and the man called for it to catch up, but the dog seemed to be fixated on something. So the man backed up and looked in the same direction of where the dog was staring and noticed a strange object. He brushed some dirt off of it and went to pick it up, but in that split second it dawned on him what he was looking at. It was a human skull. Law enforcement was called in, and after a few hours, they revealed that the skull belonged to Carmen Chan. Officials stated that there were 3 markings on the skull made by a firearm. Additionally, it was estimated that Carmen had died about a year earlier, so possibly not long after she was kidnapped. Theories started to come up left and right, suggesting that maybe Carmen wasn't actually abducted by Mr. Cruel. Both Sharon and Nicola, and even the very first victim we went over, were kept alive. So was it possible that investigators now had a brand new criminal on their hands? It was definitely a possibility, but both police and Phyllis shared their theory. Phyllis said that Carmen was rather stubborn and it wouldn't be unlike her to fight back against her kidnapper. At some point, she may have been able to unmask Mr. Cruel, leading to her death. And there is another detail from both Sharon and Nicola's cases that I haven't presented yet. Both of them shared the exact same statement from Mr. Cruel. He said, "My freedom is worth more than your life." Officially, Carmen is also considered a victim of Mr. Cruel. Surprisingly, no future cases have ever been officially connected to Mr. Cruel, or at least not in the same area. And it should be stated that there were many cases involving minors during the 80s that contain details that line up with Mr. Cruel, but those other cases have never been confirmed to be connected to him. So it's entirely possible that he has even more victims out there than the 4 that we discussed. Some people suspected that Mr. Cruel may have been employed in a local school system. All of the abductions/attacks had occurred during a time when the kids were on a break from school. Nicola and Carmen also attended the same school. If you recall, when I was going over Nicola's segment, I mentioned that Mr. Cruel took her school uniform. It's not exactly understood why Mr. Cruel chose this outfit in particular, but it may have been possible that he was trying to live out a specific fantasy in his head. Or he may have picked it out just by chance. This theory obviously goes way more in depth, and there are quite a few people who support this possibility, which just makes the guy all the more scarier. If he truly was employed by a school, he would have been amongst children almost every day of the week. If you've been watching the channel for a while now, or frequently watch videos on these true crime mysteries, you might be thinking that surely modern technology could identify Mr. Cruel soon. And sure, that would be the case for most events, except Mr. Cruel had not left behind a single trace of his DNA at any of the 4 crime scenes. And there really weren't very many witnesses that had meaningful information on his appearance either. But there was a semi-recent statement made in 2022 from a potential witness back in 1988 that is quite interesting. Or rather, it was the sister of 2 witnesses that shared this information. So 2 boys said that about a month and a half before Sharon Wills was kidnapped, there was a strange looking man that looked like he was up to no good filming the neighborhood, specifically Sharon Wills' house. Now, the exact location where the boys saw this man was in this secluded little field that was behind some houses with 2 electrical towers. The sister of the boy stated that only a local with knowledge of the area would be aware of that particular field. And if we zoom out a bit, all 4 victims were relatively close to each other in location. The boys continued and shared their description of the man to police. When they entered the field, the man's back was turned to the boys. It looked as though he was trying to climb over the Wills family fence to get a better recording. Then the man turned around and saw the kids and left. The boy said that he had a very distinct appearance, one that would easily be picked out in a crowd. He was out of shape, with a dirty, baggy flannel and light-colored jeans. His skin was very pale and he had a beard. He was also balding, but the hair he had on the sides of his head were said to be a brownish color. And you might be thinking to yourself right now that there is no way this description is accurate given that they only shared this information decades after they had seen the guy. But that just goes to show how distinct his appearance was, and the boys made an emphasis on how weird this guy was when it came to carrying himself. He just looked like he didn't belong anywhere. These particular details have led to another theory suggesting that Mr. Cruel worked at some sort of electrical facility or a landscaping business. Otherwise, how would he have known about that field? It's possible that he stumbled upon it by chance, but it seems that locals are not convinced. Another interesting discussion in this case is the possibility that Mr. Cruel had many more victims even before the 4 that we went over. However, these prior cases may have been with women rather than minors. A forensic psychologist named Tim Watson Monroe shared that he believed that Mr. Cruel's quote-unquote fixation towards minors may have been something that developed later on in his life. Watson was brought in by police to help profile Mr. Cruel. In that process, Watson had been informed of other assault cases of both adult women and minors. One of these cases actually involved a nun said to be in her 60s to 70s. Several other cases Watson was shown also included women being bound in a similar fashion to Mr. Cruel's known victims. So what is being suggested is Mr. Cruel may have had a long history of adults, but over time he became bored. That's when he set his sights on children since it brought along a new rush for him. It's possible that this change in preference also began sooner than the first official victim in 1987. In February of 1985, an unnamed 14-year-old girl in Hampton, Melbourne was kidnapped and later set free. According to the girl, her kidnapper said some things that are consistent with Mr. Cruel's confirmed victims, but the specifics regarding that case have not been released. And who's to say that there weren't more cases committed before 1985 that can be tied back to Mr. Cruel that police have just kept under wraps? In my own mind, I don't think these 4 cases even scratches the surface of the horrific acts this man has done. It's now been nearly 4 decades since the first attack, making many think that this string of cases will never be solved, and that may very well hold true since Mr. Cruel has left behind 0 DNA evidence. Let me know what you think in the comments. Ever since I started listening to true crime cases, this one has always stuck out for me. At one point, it was even suggested that Mr. Cruel may have left Australia and continued his crime elsewhere. There was even a loose connection between the Golden State Killer and Mr. Cruel. But obviously, that possibility has since disappeared with the identification and arrest of the Golden State Killer. Authorities later stated that they believed that the trio of Bobby, Sherilyn, and Madison spent no more than 15 minutes in the woods before returning to the truck. But what happened after they got to their vehicle is a toss-up. Over 100 authorities and volunteers, as well as search dogs, were utilized to search the area, but no trace of the family was ever found. There was, however, an 11-page letter written by Sherilyn tucked away in the truck. In it, Sherilyn detailed her distaste towards her husband since she felt that he didn't do enough for his family. She described him as being a hermit and voiced her desire to file for divorce. Then on November 6, 2013, the remains of Bobby, Sherilyn, and Madison were finally discovered. They were located about 3 miles away from the location of the truck. Now, the bodies weren't confirmed to belong to the Jamisons until a year after their discovery, but the public and investigators were more or less certain that they were a match long before that. Due to the severe decomposition, medical officials had a tough time determining a cause of death. But on the back of Bobby's skull was this tiny hole, which some believe may have been caused by a bullet. Theories immediately started spreading once more, one of which suggested that the entire incident was a murder-suicide. Factoring in Sherilyn's inconsistent mental health, the letter in the truck, and the pistol that she was known to carry around, this may have been possible. But this pistol was never found. Plus, families and friends of Sherilyn did state that while she may have had some disagreements with her husband, she still deeply loved her family. Instead, they proposed the idea that the family was kidnapped, which was also a popular theory. Since there were no signs of a struggle within the truck, it may have been possible that the family was led to the forest while being held by a gun. This idea could be supported by the fact that many personal items were left behind, including the family's dog. This theory goes a bit deeper, and some believe that the family was murdered in an event that was related to illegal substances. The fact that the family was carrying $32,000 in cash also raises a lot of eyebrows. Bobby's own father was suspected of being responsible since Bobby had a protective order filed against him. But since he was at a nursing home during the family's disappearance, he was quickly written off as a possible suspect. Owen Hart, born on May 7, 1965 in Calgary, which is a city in Alberta, Canada, was thrust into the world of wrestling from an early age, having 2 older brothers who wrestled and a father who taught them. Owen's father's name was Stu. Stu was a local wrestling legend and ran a renowned wrestling school. Owen excelled at wrestling in high school, and he made his professional debut while in college and later trained with his father, joining Stu's Stampede Wrestling in the 1980s. Owen's talent took him to Japan in 1987, where he competed in New Japan Pro.
In Star Trek Fleet Command, your starship is the difference between life or
wrestling. His hard work paid off when he became the first non-Japanese wrestler to capture the IWGP Junior Heavyweight Championship in 1988. After finding success in Stampede Wrestling and Japan, Owen signed with the WWF. Here, Owen adopted a superhero persona, debuting as the masked Blue Blazer. Despite his potential, Owen often found himself in mid-card matches, serving as enhancement talent. Owen would later leave the WWF after losing at WrestleMania 5. After his time on WrestleMania, Owen jumped around various cities and countries under the Blue Blazer character until 1991, and later found himself back with the WWF. Now, the focus of this particular entry does not occur until May of 1999. A pay-per-view event was being held on May 23rd, 1999 in Kansas City, Missouri called Over the Edge. At the time, Owen had moved away from the Blue Blazer character within the WWF, but for this event, the WWF decided to bring back the Blue Blazer and have Owen perform a stunt where he would come flying in from the rafters of the arena. So, come time for Owen to make his grand entrance, he was all set up in the rafter of the Kemper Arena, simply waiting for a signal to fly in. Owen's harness was equipped with a quick-release mechanism. The act was originally planned to have Owen come short of reaching the ring for comedic effect. This would lead to Owen having to manually free himself and make the rest of the way on foot. So the cue finally came and Owen flew in towards the arena. Or at least that's what was expected. Instead, what happened was Owen fell 70 feet before hitting the top rope and landing in the ring. Obviously, the audience had no idea if this was somehow part of the act or if they had just witnessed a terrible accident. Unfortunately, it was the latter. Commentators Jerry Lawler and Jim Ross were equally as confused and attempted to inform the audience as to what they had just seen. Medical officials were rushed to the ring and transported Owen out of the building and to a hospital, but the fall was too much and Owen was pronounced dead as a result of internal bleeding and blunt force trauma. Apparently, Owen's final words before meeting his end were "look out." The event itself did continue, which led to heavy criticism from fans later on. Owen's now widow, Martha Hart, eventually stated that she forgave the WWF for what happened, but she wanted concrete answers as to what went wrong. So after months of investigation, it was stated that the harness and release mechanisms were not properly secured. They were also said to be defective, so even if they were secured properly, there was still risk of an accident. In November of 2000, the Hart family and the WWF settled a lawsuit where the Harts would receive $18 million. Most of said money went on to establish the Owen Hart Foundation. A former Egyptian model named Omaima Uri Nelson is infamously known for taking the life of her husband, William Nelson. This act of violence placed Omaima in the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla, California. This case in particular sticks out for many due to the graphic details that come along with it. Omaima grew up in Egypt before moving to the US in 1986. According to reports, Omaima met William Nelson in 1991 while playing pool in a bar. William, a former pilot, had previously been convicted of smuggling illegal substances in 1984. After serving a 4-year sentence in federal prison, William was released on parole and started a new career path. When the two met, Omaima was about half of William's age, William being 56 years old. After just a few days of talking, the two actually got engaged and were married to each other. Of course, you are not going to learn very much about someone in the matter of a few days. Sometime after getting married to William, Omaima noticed that he was a rather violent man. Small disagreements turned into heated arguments, which then quickly devolved into instances of physical and violence, at least according to Omaima. For example, one time when William asked Omaima for sex but was denied, he ended up tossing her kitten out of the car window, then yelling, "I paid for you. I'm getting what I paid for." Fast forward to Thanksgiving of 1991, Omaima was fed up with her situation and decided that more drastic measures were necessary. According to Omaima, that day, William tried to rape her, but in an act of defense, she grabbed a lamp and smashed it over William's head. This was followed with Omaima reaching for a pair of scissors and taking William's life. Now, for most cases, things would likely end here, but this time around, it gets much more disturbing. After William died, Omaima did a number of things with the body, including mixing some of the remains with Thanksgiving leftovers and boiling his fingerprints off his hands. Afterwards, Omaima called 2 of her ex-boyfriends to help dispose of what else was left. She even asked one of them to help remove his teeth. Sometime later, authorities pulled over Omaima when she was spotted driving William's red Corvette through Costa Mesa. Inside the vehicle, police found trash bags containing William's remains. This led to an investigation of the couple's residence, where investigators stated that the walls and floors were stained with blood. Later interviews with neighbors revealed that there was what sounded like grinding sounds coming from William and Omaima's apartment. This sound went on continuously for at least 48 hours. Now, unfortunately, YouTube is very nitpicky when it comes to describing actual details in gruesome cases like this, but I wanted to be clear that it's even more graphic than what I have already shared. In the end, investigators determined that about a third of William was still missing. Omaima was arrested on December 2nd, 1991 under the suspicion that she was responsible for William's death. During Omaima's trial, she and her attorney argued that William's death was simply a result of self-defense. Omaima was also formally diagnosed with PTSD. Ultimately, she was found guilty of second-degree murder and received a sentence of 25 to life in jail. Over a decade later, in 2006, during her first parole hearing, Omaima stated that she had deep regret for her actions in 1991 and was now a quote-unquote born-again Christian. But after further evaluation, investigation, Omaima was denied parole as officials believed that she was mentally ill and volatile. Omaima actually remarried while in jail to a man in his early to mid 70s, right around when she was eligible for parole again, but yet again she was denied. This time around, Omaima's attorney shared some new details. Apparently, Omaima disposed of William in the way she did because she feared that he would punish her in the afterlife. Additionally, the psychiatrist who diagnosed Omaima as insane stated that Omaima revealed she wore a red hat, red high heels, and red lipstick in what she called a ritual on the night of William's death. This final case is really just a sad event, and it's crazy to think that a child is capable of this. It takes us back to September 18th, 2022. 12-year-old Emma Brown was with her father, Daniel, who was 38 at the time, at home in Poolville, Texas. It was here where Emma shot her dad, believing he had died. Afterwards, Emma ran out of the house onto the driveway, where she then turned the weapon towards herself. Medical officials were contacted, and both Emma and Daniel were transported to the hospital where Daniel would survive. But 2 days after the incident, Emma passed away from her injuries. So just what in the world would cause a 12-year-old to do something so insane? Well, after investigation by authorities, it was determined that Emma had actually formed a murder pact with another 12-year-old girl. At first, it was believed that this other kid was from her school, but this was later said to be false. Apparently, this pact entailed that Emma and the other child would both kill their families before running away together. It seems that at some point after hurting her father, Emma may have had second thoughts and realized how grave of a mistake she had just made. There really is very little information that is public on this case, but I was trying to find out more details about this other kid who Emma made a pact with. There wasn't much, but this was what I could find. The other girl, who remains unnamed, lived in Lufkin, Texas, which to my understanding is about 4 to 5 hours from where Emma lived. Now, it's a bit unclear who was going to do this, but at some point after killing both of their families, either this other girl or Emma was supposed to drive over 200 miles to pick the other up. A lot of people suspected that Emma came across this other person online, which instantly made me think that this wasn't actually a 12-year-old girl. I started thinking that this was some malicious adult trying to manipulate Emma, but it turns out that this other person really was just a kid. This unnamed girl went on to be charged with conspiracy to commit murder, but specific details were not revealed. Investigators questioned this other girl to figure out just why they even wanted to do this in the first place, but it doesn't seem that they got a straight answer. It's also entirely possible that they wanted to do it just to do it. Sometimes kids don't need a motive to act a certain way at that age. One official was quoted saying, "I will say that this case is a time to remind parents that it's very important to know who your children are friends with, whether that's in the classroom, social media apps, Snapchat, TikTok, and then also gaming platforms." Emma's family were also questioned about the other girl, but they said they had no idea who she even was.
In Puerto Rico, we call ourselves Boricua, a unique name honoring the vibrant spirit of our people. When you experience
The Gladbeck hostage crisis was an incident that took place in Germany in mid-August of 1988, specifically on the 16th to 18th. The young woman you are currently seeing on screen was named Silke Bischoff, and she was 18 years old at the time. Silke had unfortunately been taken hostage by two bank robbers who both had a criminal record. Their names were Hans-Jürgen Rossner and Dieter Degowski. The duo eventually forced their way onto a public bus which carried about 30 passengers, and after reaching their destination, they were all allowed to leave except for two. Several lives would be claimed during this ordeal. The incident began in 1988 on the 16th of August when two armed men with hoods had busted their way into the Deutsche Bank right as they opened up their doors for the public. A bystander had witnessed the odd-looking men and called police around 8 a.m. and just as the two armed robbers exited the building, they noticed a cop car pulling up, which caused them to go back inside and get a couple of hostages. They fired off their weapons several times inside the bank, demanding a getaway car and ransom money. Negotiations spanned several hours, but the criminals were provided with not only an additional 6 figures of ransom money, but also received an Audi 100 around 9:45 a.m. Using the getaway car, the men picked up a woman named Marion, who was Hans's girlfriend. Then on the 17th, the group hijacked a public bus around 7 p.m. Again, there were about 30 people on board. Something you don't exactly see every day is that the criminals actually invited the gathering media crews to hold interviews while they held their hostages in hand. And what's really messed up is that some of these people conducting interviews actually provided photos of the officers ahead just so the robbers wouldn't get tricked if they had some sort of exchange plan drawn up. There were even a number of interviewers who gave beverages to the men in exchange for some words. One interviewer even asked Silke what it felt like to have a firearm pressed against her. During these interviews, Marion snuck off to use the bathroom and police were able to apprehend her. When Hans learned of this, he demanded an exchange. In return for Marion, he would allow a hostage to go free. However, for every 5 minutes that passed without a deal being agreed upon, he would take the life of a hostage. This led to the death of a 15-year-old boy who tried protecting his sister. Now, police actually did intend on returning Marion for one of the hostages, however, they fumbled by breaking their handcuff key, which led to them wasting what little time they had. It took over 20 minutes for medical help to arrive, and the boy would die just hours after being checked into the hospital. Hans and Dieter then made the decision to drive the bus away, which led to the death of a police officer who gave chase. The officer had collided with a truck. The bus finally crossed into the Netherlands around 2:30 a.m. and about 3 hours later, 5 hostages were released, 3 of which were children. Police demanded that the kids were let out or else they would not even entertain any further negotiations. Yet again, the criminals were given a getaway vehicle where they fled the scene with their 2 hostages. But around 2 p.m. on the 18th, a police cruiser rammed into it. This completely immobilized the vehicle, causing a gunfight to break out between the police and Hans and Dieter. One of the 2 hostages still being held was able to escape during the chaos, but Silke was not as lucky. She was struck in the heart by a bullet and ultimately died. As for Hans and Dieter, they were both arrested. This next entry revolves around a young woman named Kaylee Muthart. Kaylee was known as a high-achieving and diligent student that was even in the National Honor Society during her time in high school. However, at the age of 17, Kaylee left school. The reason being was a mixture of issues outside of school which caused her grades to diminish. These included her heart arrhythmia and working extensive hours at work in order to save up for a car. According to Kaylee, she believed that the best choice for her would be to take a break from class in order to salvage her academic record and still obtain a college scholarship. By the time Kaylee was 18, she had started to change. She began to consume alcohol and smoking marijuana. Kaylee shared that her family also had a history of becoming addicted to these types of substances, so she believed that she may be prone to it as well. Another detail that should be mentioned is that Kaylee is a Christian. One particular day when Kaylee was smoking, she stated that she felt abnormally closer to God. She was with a friend at the time and believed that the marijuana she consumed was laced with something harder. And not long after, Kaylee also lost her job. It's unclear if she was fired or had quit voluntarily. Her relationship with her boyfriend had also started falling apart. To deal with the stress, Kaylee ventured off into other substances, including Xanax. She was also diagnosed with bipolar disorder around this time. Kaylee was quoted saying, "It makes sense, since when I felt happy, I felt super happy, and when I felt down, I felt deeply depressed." Fast forward to August of the same year, Kaylee continued to battle depression and recalled that euphoric feeling she experienced back with the tampered joint. So she got the idea of obtaining that feeling again by finding out just what else had been mixed in. This led to Kaylee trying out meth. She was unable to sleep for several days and experienced disturbing hallucinations. For example, when she looked into the mirror, she shared that something looked odd with her face and blackheads started to appear. This caused her to pick at her face to the point where there was blood. After this incident, Kaylee continued to struggle with her mental health. But this time, she was debating on whether or not she should try some other harder substances. Ultimately, Kaylee experimented with other stuff while still studying the Bible, which will play a key factor in her future hallucinations. Around November-December, Kaylee's circle of friends primarily consisted of addicts. Kaylee's family tried to help her and even get her to commit to rehab, but that never happened. She was also hopping around house to house, struggling with her substance abuse. Then on the night of February 5th, 2018, Kaylee took a significantly larger dose of and the next morning on the 6th, she stated that she began to hallucinate. After recalling fragments of that morning and comparing them to what onlookers had witnessed, Kaylee said that this is how she believed events unfolded. The friend that Kaylee was staying with at the time was not present on the morning of the 6th, so Kaylee thought that she had gone to church, so she walked along a train track that led to it. Despite being 10:30 a.m. at this point, Kaylee said everything looked dark. And it was in the darkness where she noticed a source of light with what looked like a white bird resting at the top of it. For whatever reason, this prompted Kaylee to think that she needed to offer up a sacrifice to the world. In her mind, this was a request from God. If she didn't sacrifice anything, everyone she knew would die. This sacrifice would end up being Kaylee's eyes, and she was totally convinced that this entire scenario was real. So she collapsed to her knees and cried out, "Why me?" And then Kaylee proceeded to remove her eyes. The actual details that she shared are way too graphic to be shared on YouTube, and she later stated that if no one helped her, she would have gone much further. Apparently, Kaylee wasn't too far from the church at this point, and a pastor actually saw her, so he rushed out and restrained her from causing any more damage. Kaylee was immediately rushed to the hospital, and what was left of her eyes were removed in order to prevent infection and salvage what was left of her optic nerves. She wouldn't wake up for 2 days, but when she did, Kaylee stated that everything was dark and she knew exactly why that was. Kaylee was officially blind. She said that she had plans to attend 90 Narcotics Anonymous meetings over the course of 90 days shortly after being discharged from the hospital. She was quoted saying, "It took losing my sight to get me back on the right path, but from the bottom of my heart, I'm so glad I'm here." Ursula Herrmann was described as a fun and kind little girl who lived in Bavaria, Germany. In her free time, she was often found practicing piano or doing gymnastics. Where Ursula lived, there was a stretch of forest that was frequented by hikers, bikers, and joggers alike. On September 15th, 1981, 10-year-old Ursula went on a bike trip back home from her cousin's place. And it's on this bike ride where Ursula would go missing. School had ended and Ursula had just finished her gymnastics lesson after class with her cousin. After hanging out at her cousin's house for a bit, Ursula headed back home. It was about 7:30 p.m. at this point. It wasn't so dark to where you couldn't see yet, but the night was well underway. Normally, this bike ride home wouldn't take more than 10 minutes. So after about half an hour after Ursula set out, her mother began to worry and called her sister, believing that Ursula hadn't left yet. To her shock, she was told that Ursula left nearly 30 minutes ago. This prompted Ursula's father to rush out in search of her. Even Ursula's uncle helped out in the search, but nobody could find any trace of the now missing girl. Police were contacted, and in no longer than an hour, large search teams consisting of police and firemen were out looking for Ursula. Hours would pass and no clues would be found. Hope was beginning to fade with everyone as rain started to pour, which made the dogs much less effective. However, just before midnight, Ursula's red bike was found, but still no sign of Ursula herself. The search continued the next day, and news of Ursula's disappearance started to spread fast. Radio shows informed the public of the missing girl, who stood at about 4 foot 7 inches tall with blonde hair, last seen wearing a gray woolen cardigan and reddish sandals. 2 days after Ursula disappeared, Ursula's parents received a phone call, but when they picked up, there was nothing but silence on the other end. Then, suddenly, a brief tune could be heard. They believed that this was a jingle played by a local radio station. The parents weren't exactly sure how to handle this situation. The calls definitely felt sinister, but it's not like they really revealed any information. What was the caller's intention in the first place? Could it be a hoax, or was it a legitimate call from the kidnapper? Similar calls were made to the Herman household that night, which led to police setting up equipment to record any future calls. Then, the very next day, the case would make a significant progression. A grim letter was delivered to Ursula's father. The letter consisted of words constructed from cutouts from various newspaper clippings. Being that this was in German, this was what the letter roughly translated to. "We kidnapped your daughter. If you ever want to see your daughter alive again, then pay the ransom," which was about 500,000 USD. And what's really interesting is that this letter was actually intended to be delivered a day earlier. It mentioned how the kidnappers would make a call to the family, and the parents needed to just say if they would or wouldn't pay the money. If they chose not to pay the ransom, or if they called police, Ursula would be killed. That same day, another call was made to the Hermans. Ursula's mother said that they would pay the money, but begged for some sort of proof that Ursula was still alive. However, the kidnappers didn't provide such proof. Another letter was delivered to the Hermans on the 21st of September, which provided instructions on how the ransom money would be delivered. The location wasn't revealed, but the culprits wanted Ursula's father to drive their yellow Fiat 600 by himself with the money. Now, the Hermans were a normal family that couldn't possibly pay such an egregious amount of money. So a member of the local community donated a portion of the ransom while the state provided the difference. The money was now in order. The family just needed the final instructions to carry out the exchange. But no new letters were received, nor were there any phone calls. In the meantime, investigators tried their hand once more in the forest to try and obtain some clues that might lead to the kidnapper. Over 100 people were part of this search party, and an additional 10 dogs were added. The search team was ready to invest several weeks worth of time into gathering clues, but it would only take 4 days for a major discovery to be made. On that 4th day of searching, rain was trickling down and the scene was gray. By this time, the vast majority of the forest had already been thoroughly combed through. Then someone yelled out for help. In a tucked away location of the forest, about 800 meters from the main path, an officer had hit something when digging in the dirt. Several other officers helped the man dig deeper, and they found a plank of wood that was wrapped in a blanket. The officers pulled this wooden panel out, which revealed another wooden board. This other one had several bolts fastened to it, which would allow the panel to slide off like a lid. It was approximately 2.5 feet by 2 feet. The lid was forced open, and to the horror of everyone there, they found Ursula inside. It said that several officers began to shed tears as they gazed at the deceased child. Ursula's parents were contacted and informed of the news. Her mother was at a loss for words, while her father continuously questioned if she had been hurt before her death. Medical officials determined that Ursula passed away anywhere between 1 and 5 hours before being left in the forest. The case gets a bit stranger though, as the box was about 4.6 feet deep. There was a seat inside that acted as a makeshift toilet, and there were also bottles of water, soda, candy, and other snacks inside. Furthermore, there was an assortment of about 20 books inside. By all intents and purposes, it seemed like the intent was to keep Ursula alive and entertained while she was buried underground. But if that were the case, how did she end up dying? There's actually a pretty simple answer. Ursula simply ran out of oxygen. Whoever designed the box included a ventilation system, but there was no device to actually allow for air to circulate. Investigators believe that whoever was responsible visited the forest to bring out Ursula. However, they discovered that she had died, which is why the Hermans never received any additional updates. Additionally, after seeing the box, police believed that there were actually 2 people involved in the crime, possibly even more. Investigators came to this conclusion due to the size of Ursula's box, not to mention it weighed over 100 pounds. They also think that it was a local or someone that frequented the area due to the location in the forest in which the box was buried. Over the years, numerous interesting suspects would arise, one of which was a man named Werner Masaryk. Werner was known by locals to be a quick-tempered man who was skilled with his hands. However, his fingerprint did not match the one that was found on the box. Other residents' fingerprints were also obtained, but it didn't belong to anybody. Despite this, police were still confident that Werner was their man. Sometime later, one of Werner's friends was questioned. His name was Klaus Fathinger. Klaus was a known alcoholic who was also an unemployed engineer. During his questioning, Klaus revealed that Werner asked him to dig a hole in the forest. Investigators immediately jumped in excitement, believing that they had just closed the case. But this feeling wouldn't last long. When asked to lead them to the location of the hole to see if Klaus was being truthful, he couldn't locate it. During the drive back to the station, Klaus admitted to lying. As for Werner, he was never found guilty of any involvement. Years would go by and nobody would be charged with the crime. However, in the late 2000s, the case would reignite an old spark. Werner Masaryk would find himself at the focal point of Ursula's disappearance once again. So Ursula's case was not considered a murder. Instead, it was regarded as a kidnapping with deadly consequences. And with this particular crime, there was a 30-year statute of limitations. So investigators were sort of rushing to find their culprit. State prosecutors looked back at past evidence and found the names of Werner and Klaus. It was 2007 and Klaus was dead, while Werner was still alive in Germany. After obtaining a new sample of Werner's saliva and testing it against new DNA evidence found on the box, the two were deemed not a match. But authorities still thought that Werner was the kidnapper. So they searched his home and found an old tape recorder. And this is about where a lot of people tend to believe that Werner was wrongly accused. You remember that jingle I mentioned that was placed in the phone calls to Ursula's parents? Well, a sound expert was brought in to compare the recordings on the tape recorder with the jingle heard in the phone calls. And they concluded that this exact device was used in Ursula's abduction. So Werner was arrested in May of 2008. In 2009, his trial commenced and he was quoted saying, "I know I was certainly not a good citizen, sometimes rude, and will see many attempts to portray me as a bad person, but I have nothing to do with this act." And it was true, Werner was not a good guy. Even his children said that he was terrible. On one occasion, Werner even took the family dog and locked it in the basement freezer where it ultimately died. His wife at the time actually divorced him because of this. Moments like this in Werner's life were brought up to further highlight that he was someone capable of kidnapping a child. When questioned as to why he locked up the dog, Werner said that he was punishing it by exiling it to Siberia. Ultimately, Werner was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. And this case does have a lot of finer details which would keep us here for hours. But one final point I want to touch on is Michael Herman, Ursula's brother. He actually does not think Werner was responsible. Michael was present at the trials instead of his parents and thus was able to take in every little detail about the case and every piece of evidence. Another civil case was brought up against Werner by Michael in 2013, which was not actually focused around Ursula. Instead, the case was about Michael's tinnitus, which he claimed was caused by the extensive trials and criminal case of Werner. Michael was actually on Werner's side here. By initiating this case, Werner had an opportunity to prove his innocence, because Werner's defense was going to fight the case on the basis that he was wrongfully accused in the first place. But Werner would lose yet again in the end, and he had to pay a fee to Michael, meaning that the court was still convinced of the verdict from Werner's initial trial. Even then, Michael was adamant that Ursula did not get true justice, but he didn't pursue the matter any further. And there is one final piece of information I'd like to talk about for this case. In March of 2021, there was an anonymous letter made out to several media outlets in Germany. Whoever the sender was, they confessed to Ursula's kidnapping. According to them, they were in high school when they committed the crime, but nobody bothered to dig into the letter any further as the case had legally been closed by this point. That Ursula did not get true justice, but he didn't pursue the matter any further. And there is one final piece of information I'd like to talk about for this case. In March of 2021, there was an anonymous letter made out to several media outlets in Germany. Whoever the sender was, they confessed to Ursula's kidnapping. According to them, they were in high school when they committed the crime, but nobody bothered to dig into the letter any further as the case had legally been closed by this point. This next entry is about a serial killer by the name of Robert Pickton, aka the Pig Farm Killer. He was convicted of taking the lives of 6 women in 2007, but he has admitted to killing 49 people in an interview. When law enforcement first conducted a search at Pickton's pig farm, their objective was to uncover illegal firearms. However, what they stumbled upon was far more disturbing. This prompted them to swiftly secure a second warrant for a more thorough investigation of the property. What they discovered was like something out of a horror movie. Scattered across the premises were human remains, with many of them found within the pigsties. Medical officials later determined that a significant amount of the remains belonged to indigenous women. Robert's father was rarely present during his childhood. Robert also had an older sister named Linda and a younger brother named David, all of whom were raised primarily by their mother, Louise. Louise was remembered as a gritty, hard-working woman who also ingrained that personality into her kids. The children often spent their entire days after school working on the farm, and as you could imagine, the children frequently carried a pungent odor around. This stench made Robert a prime target by other kids in school. Sometimes when bullies would chase him, Robert would actually hide inside the carcasses of animals on the farm, specifically pigs, to avoid being caught. At school, Robert also struggled to talk to girls, and whenever he did work up the courage to, he was always shot down and made fun of. In terms of grades, Robert also didn't see much success, leading him to drop out early on. The treatment he experienced by other children led to Robert retaining mental scars, and it didn't help that his parents weren't exactly the nurturing type. On one occasion, Robert's parents even slaughtered a calf that Robert deeply cared for and raised himself. Another moment that scarred Robert's early life occurred in October of 1967, and interestingly enough, this event didn't actually involve him. So, his brother Dave was out driving his father's truck when he accidentally rammed into a teenage boy named Tim Barrett. Dave panicked and rushed back home to get his mother Louise. Together, the two returned to the site of the accident, and after inspecting the boy, Louise decided to move the body into this deep swamp area near the road. The very next day, Tim's body was found, and it was determined that he had drowned to death, and that the injuries from the car accident didn't actually kill him. Robert respected his mother greatly, and knowing of her actions sort of enabled Robert to do the same thing later in his life. His first victim was killed in the early 90s in Vancouver, British Columbia on a remote farm run by Robert himself and his brother. The brothers even started a charity organization and held parties and gatherings at their farm to promote it. However, these events were simply disguised as charities. They were actually degenerate parties that often included criminals and workers and frequently went up to several thousand people at a time. Initially, there wasn't much suspicion that something was happening on the farm, but in 1997, one of the workers at one of Robert's parties reported that he had attempted to murder her. The charge was ultimately dismissed, but this occurrence did make a few investigators uneasy. Fast forward to February of 2002, Robert's farm was raided by law enforcement after receiving a report that he had illegal firearms in his possession. Police weren't able to find any illegal weapons, but they did find items belonging to several missing women. This led to a deeper search of the property with the goal of finding human remains, and in the end, they obtained DNA from over 30 different women. Robert received 5 murder charges immediately, which increased to 26 in 2005. According to Robert, he would take his victims to a meat rendering plant and then feed the remains to his pigs. He was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. His sentence included a 25-year prison term, which was the max sentence for his crimes. Robert was believed to have committed many more murders, but the judge did not allow for those charges to be included as they wouldn't be able to increase his sentence. Living in Monument, Colorado was a 13-year-old boy named Dylan Redwine who lived with his mother Elaine and brother Corey. Dylan was one of the many unfortunate children who had to experience his parents separating at a young age. He regularly went on court-ordered visits with his father, Mark Redwine, who resided in the rugged and mountainous landscape of La Plata County, nestled in the southwestern area of Colorado. And you may assume that a son would rejoice whenever he gets the chance to spend more time with a parent that he isn't always with. However, this was not the case with Dylan. Dylan found little to no joy in spending time with his father and had intentionally avoided these encounters for several months. The root cause of this can be traced back to a distressing incident that occurred at his father's house the previous year. In the summer of 2011, specifically in June, Dylan, accompanied by his older brother Corey, visited his father's home. While the brothers were using their father's laptop, they inadvertently stumbled upon some very disturbing images. At the time, Mark was asleep, so the brothers took the laptop and ran to the bathroom and locked themselves in. Displayed on the screen were images of their father Mark clad in a wig and women's lingerie, cradling what seemed to be a soiled diaper. The brothers went through all of the images, and that's when they realized something. Their father appeared to be consuming the contents of the diaper. Corey brought out his phone and took pictures of these unsettling images, marking a turning point in how Dylan perceived his father. So over the following year, Dylan distanced himself, becoming more withdrawn and fighting with the decision to confront his father about this discovery. On November 19th, 2012, a court mandate made Dylan visit his father for Thanksgiving. Dylan's mother Elaine didn't really want to send him off though, since she recognized he changed in his behavior. He was showing obvious signs of distress and discomfort. For what reason though, she had no idea. In the end, Dylan agreed, but before he went off, he went to his brother Corey and gave him a request. Dylan asked him to send over those images that they took from their father's laptop. Dylan was mustering up the courage and confidence to ask his father about these images and hopefully share the information with his brother Corey when he got back. However, Corey would never get to see his brother ever again. On November 18th, 2012, Mark Redwine picked up his son from the airport. Surveillance footage at both the airport and a local Walmart in Durango showed little interaction between the father and son. Apparently, Dylan asked his father if he could spend the night with a friend upon arrival, but Mark insisted otherwise and they both spent the evening at Mark's residence. Through text messages, Dylan organized a visit to his friend's house at around 6:30 a.m. the following morning, with his last known communication on his phone occurring at 9:37 p.m. the previous night. When Dylan's friend texted him at around 6:46 a.m. on November 19th asking about where he was, there was no response. On the night of November 19th, 2012, Mark reported that his 13-year-old son, Dylan, was missing. News of Dylan's disappearance spread fast, leading to a large search and rescue operation. After Dylan went missing, his dad acted in a way that seemed strange for a parent whose child is lost. Mark stayed home and he didn't even try to find Dylan. When media went to interview him, he seemed rather withdrawn. Months were invested into the search effort, but due to the rough terrain and high elevation of Durango, little success was made. Despite numerous efforts to locate him, Dylan remained missing and no new information came in about his whereabouts. On January 31st, 2013, Mark participated in an exclusive interview blaming himself for his son's disappearance. According to Mark, Dylan was asleep when he woke up that morning, and upon returning from running some errands, he discovered that his son was missing. Now, the public initially sympathized with the father, not knowing any better, but the public will soon learn how undeserving Mark was of this sympathy. On June 26, 2013, the case would make new headlines, but not for the reasons people were hoping for. Human remains, including a segment of Dylan's shirt and a sock, were unearthed in a secluded location on Middle Mountain, roughly 8 miles from Mark's home. Following some testing, it was determined that the recovered remains were indeed those of the missing Dylan Redwine. When the search parties were informed about the location in which Dylan was found, they were taken aback as that particular area was very difficult to get to. It was tough to believe that a child who was unfamiliar with the area was able to find their way to it. This prompted the suspicion that foul play was involved. Mark Redwine subsequently became a person of interest, and the cause of his son's death was officially labeled as undetermined. Investigators uncovered traces of Dylan's blood in various parts of Mark's home, including the laundry room, living room, and kitchen. However, Mark vehemently denied any connection to his son's death. Only on November 1st, 2015, a full 2 years later, was Dylan's skull located. Autopsy findings indicated that the cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. Nearly 2 years following the grim discovery, on July 22nd, 2017, Mark was apprehended in Bellingham, Washington. He faced charges of second-degree murder and child abuse related to Dylan's death. Following multiple delays, Mark's trial commenced on June 14th, 2021. The defense argued that the minimal amount of blood discovered in Mark's kitchen was infinitesimally small and could have occurred in any household. Defense attorney John Moran went further, asserting that using dog-sniffing death scent techniques was deemed quote-unquote junk science. Despite the defense's effort to explain Dylan's death as an accident, proposing that he might have wandered off and met his end due to the elements or an animal attack, Mark was declared guilty on all charges on July 16th. The unsettling photos presented to the jury played a crucial role in the verdict. It was ruled that Mark Redwine killed his son in a fit of rage after being shown the images. He was sentenced to 48 years in prison on October 8th, 2021. Dylan's mother and brother were devastated, and Corey said the following: "It's been nothing short of misery over the years." Corey also often thinks about how he could have helped protect Dylan. He said, "I can't bring Dylan back. I can't talk to Dylan, so I pray to him. I dream of him. Dylan is my hero and became more of a man in 13 years than Mark became in 60. At approximately 9:30 p.m. on June 3rd, 1991, in Albuquerque, New Mexico, a trucker named Eduardo Collin decided to call it a night and checked into a Super 8 motel. The motel staff observed that Eduardo appeared to be alone, yet he requested a room suitable for 2 people. Eduardo paid in cash for a one-night stay and was instructed to check out by 11 a.m. the following morning. He nodded, smiled, and proceeded toward his room. Throughout his stay, there was no communication from Eduardo. However, a few days later, motel staff noticed that Eduardo hadn't checked out. Finding this unusual, they sent a security guard to investigate why Eduardo hadn't left. Upon reaching the room, the guard saw a "Do Not Disturb" sign on the door. He knocked but received no response. Attempting to turn the knob, he found out that the door was locked. After some effort using a screwdriver, the guard gained entry, but he realized the room was completely empty. On the table, there were bottles of beer, cigarettes, and several other items that didn't initially raise any concern. The guard continued his investigation and made his way into the bathroom. There, he made a grim discovery. Secured to the shower head was the lifeless body of a woman. Despite clear signs of decay, medical investigators were certain that this unidentified woman had passed away on the very same day Eduardo checked into the motel. Additionally, traces of illicit substances were found in her body, and the image you're seeing on screen right now is the photo that was found on the room desk. The unsettling nature is the one detail most often remembered about the case. The woman appeared to be in her mid-20s to early 30s and stood at about 5 foot 7 inches tall. When motel staff was shown the image, they didn't recognize the woman, although they confirmed that the man in the photo was indeed Eduardo. Despite obtaining Eduardo's personal information from the motel staff and confirming that it was legitimate for the most part, it would take a couple of years before police could locate him, or rather they would find his family. And it turned out that Eduardo had died, but here's the confusing part. Police pulled out that photograph from the motel and shared it with the family, but they stated that the man in the picture was not Eduardo. They also had no idea who the woman was. So if this man was not Eduardo, then who could it be? Investigators went back to look at all of the clues and evidence that they had, and there was one piece that may shed some light on the case. On that motel room table, there was a scale with the name George Martinez written on it. Investigators believed that the device was used primarily to organize illegal substances. This gave rise to theories suggesting that the female may have been a victim in a deal gone wrong. In an attempt to gather new information from the public about either people in the photo, the original version was altered. In this updated photograph, which is oddly enough even more unsettling, the woman appears with a more neutral expression. Fast forward to March 2021, police received a tip that suggested that the woman was named Becca and that she was originally from California. And to my knowledge, this possible identity was never heavily looked into and was thus never confirmed. As for the man, police still have zero idea who he is and have yet to identify him. When Becca's body was discovered, it was believed that she had taken her own life, but there are now many people that suspect foul play was involved.
This shit is creepy.
Andrew McCauley was an Australian mountaineer and sea kayaker born on August 7th, 1968. Andrew was a very ambitious individual that strived for the toughest of goals set by himself. In fact, in 2003, Andrew made the first non-stop crossing of Bass Strait via kayak. The very next year, he kayaked across the Gulf of Carpentaria. 2 years after that, he led an expedition in the Australian Antarctic Territory where the group crossed over 800 kilometers. It was becoming clear that Andrew was much too skilled for his own good. He needed that next challenge to really test himself. He set the goal of crossing the Tasman Sea in a standard one-man kayak without any outside help. Now, it should be stated that this has been done before, but those adventurers all had custom kayaks that were built for extreme conditions. If successful, the journey was well over 900 miles and would take over a month to complete. Not only was the challenge going to be long, but it was also going to put his mentality to the test, as Andrew was going to have little to nothing to eat or drink. Andrew would set off for his attempt in December of 2006, but quit only a night later. The reason being that the kayak was freezing cold and Andrew had no way of preserving any heat in his kayak. Luckily, Andrew was able to get home safely, but this small hiccup was not going to keep him away from the sea for very long, as he would return to it in January of the next year. This time around, Andrew was all ready to combat the extreme temperatures that he would face out at sea. Andrew would frequently contact his family via radio and let them know that he was doing great. He was about halfway done with the journey and it seemed like smooth sailing from there on out. However, things would take a turn for the worse very quickly. As Andrew was nearing the end, violent waves began to crash into his kayak, suddenly making the latter half of the trip significantly more difficult. This was not to mention the other conditions which have also worsened. And keep in mind, Andrew wanted to beat this challenge with a normal run-of-the-mill kayak. It was February 9th when Andrew made an emergency call saying, "Do you copy? This is Kayak 1. Do you copy? Over. I've got an emergency situation. I'm in a kayak about 30 kilometers from Milford Sound. I need a rescue. My kayak's sinking. fell off into the sea and I'm going down. But rescue would not find Andrew until it was too late. In fact, they would never find Andrew at all, but what they did find was his kayak, bobbing in the sea about 30 nautical miles from the journey's endpoint. This discovery was made on February 12th. I want to quickly mention that Andrew's kayak came with this fiberglass dome cover that was supposed to provide shelter for him. Now, whenever his kayak would flip over due to the way the dome was constructed, Andrew needed to exit the kayak and flip it over manually. It's believed that Andrew somehow lost this dome, ultimately leading to his demise. Andrew's remains were never located, but on the kayak were these photos that he took of himself in his final moments. In Star City, West Virginia, lived Skylar Neese, a 16-year-old girl with her parents David and Mary. During her childhood, Skylar had a best friend named Morgan Lawrence. In the earlier years of their friendship, the two were inseparable, but just like with most friendships from such a young age, it dwindled as the two grew older. Nevertheless, Morgan still saw Skylar as someone in her circle, almost like a family member. Another close friend of Skylar's was named Sheila Eddy. Together, the two girls started high school and met another girl named Rachel Schoaf. This group of girls went on to grow very close and hung out with each other whenever they could. Teachers and classmates did mention that the group tended to be rather rambunctious, and there were even rumors that they would use illegal substances and partake in underage drinking at parties. Fast forward to July 6th, 2012, Skylar went to a local Wendy's where she worked. This particular shift took place well into the night, so she didn't return home until very late. But when she did, she immediately went to her room and went to sleep. The next day, Skylar's dad, David, knocked on Skylar's bedroom door but received no response. In fact, the door had been locked. David was able to eventually get past the door with the use of a coat hanger, but to his shock, Skylar was nowhere to be found. He immediately called his wife Mary to inform her that their daughter was missing, but Mary seemed to not think much of this and told David that she was probably hanging out with some friends. So David calmed down a little and went out for a smoke. That's when he noticed that Skylar's bedroom window was wide open, and outside of the house at the bottom of the window was a little stool. David thought to himself that Skylar had just snuck out in the middle of the night and was intending to use the stool to get back inside, so he just left it and went about his day. After about 6 hours, Skylar's family members were surprised to receive a call from Skylar's manager saying that she had not shown up for work. At this point, Skylar's family was beginning to panic. Never once had Skylar ever missed work or even arrived late, so they called the police. When police searched Skylar's room, they noticed that most of her personal items had been left behind, indicating that she did intend to return. Around this time is when Skylar's friend Sheila called the family. She was crying non-stop, saying that Skylar, Rachel, and herself went out last night, and when they were going to return home, Skylar asked to be dropped off at a street corner instead of her house. Sheila claimed that this happened just before midnight and she has not heard from Skylar since, which at the time of the call would have meant about 18 hours had passed. So obviously, now everyone was beginning to think that Skylar had been kidnapped. Police were able to get their hands on some CCTV footage which shows Skylar running towards a 3-door car and getting into the back seat. This footage was captured right behind the house. Sheila said that the vehicle was not hers and that she did not recognize it. Unfortunately, police were not able to track down the vehicle, but they did assume that it belonged to someone that Skylar knew as she voluntarily entered it. To the police, this appeared as though Skylar was a runaway teen. Then on July 11th, there was news that somewhere in North Carolina was a girl who appeared to be Skylar accompanied by a red-haired girl. Being that she was red-haired, everyone thought that this other girl was Rachel, which just confused more people as Rachel was supposed to be at a church camp. However, Rachel would return home from camp, and during her interview, investigators noticed that she was unnaturally nervous. It was during their questioning that they realized either Rachel or Sheila isn't telling the truth. You see, the police asked Sheila to take them through the path that they took to return home that night. Then they did the same thing with Rachel, and they both gave different stories. It was noted that the girls were in Blacksville around 4 a.m. and Rachel claimed that they were there to smoke. Then Skylar requested that she be dropped off at a friend's to get some other substances. The other girls said okay and dropped her off at Skylar's friend's house. Sheila revealed a similar story, but there was one key difference. Sheila said that Skylar left by herself to her friend's house and they haven't seen her since. The very next day, Sheila retracted the statement and said that she and Rachel did in fact drop Skylar off. The investigation continued and police were of the opinion that Sheila and Rachel definitely knew more than they were letting on. But it wasn't like police had any hard evidence to charge them with. So about 5 months after Skylar's disappearance, Rachel began showing signs of instability. Her mental health was rapidly declining and she began lashing out at people for very stupid reasons. She was sent to a psychiatric unit and let out in less than a week. After being let out, she immediately ran to the police and said, "We stabbed her." Investigators asked her to elaborate and Rachel said that she and Sheila filled up a car with cleaning supplies, shovels, and new clothing. The vehicle belonged to Sheila and the two asked Skylar to come hang out and they drove out to Greene County, Pennsylvania. There, the three girls roamed into the woods and jumped Skylar. Both Rachel and Sheila said that on the count of 3, they would stab her to death. They pulled out knives that they had hidden in their hoodies and easily overpowered Skylar. But Skylar was able to break Rachel's knife out of her grip and drive it into Rachel's ankle, which caused her to screech and run off. While Rachel retreated, Sheila remained and continued her attack, all while her friend screamed out, "Why?" When the two murderers were sure that Skylar was no longer alive, they tried to bury her but later settled for leaving her under some leaves and scraps. Then the two just drove off and continued with their lives. So surely the two must have had a very good reason for doing something so rash and evil. When investigators asked Rachel why they did it, she simply said, "We just didn't like her anymore." Police were able to locate Skylar's remains on January 16th, 2013. But one strange thing about the case was, even though Sheila knew that her crimes were revealed, she attempted to avoid reality online. For example, she would upload a photo of the trio with the caption, "Rest easy Skylar, you'll always be my best friend." Officials struggled at securing a true motive from the duo, but there were a couple of theories. One of which seemed to be that Skylar knew some secrets about Sheila and Rachel and those two didn't want her to reveal them. Skylar's diary also hinted at this possibility. Sheila pled not guilty but was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment. Rachel pled guilty and received a reduced sentence of 30 years. Now, apparently, Rachel actually got married in prison in the women's only facility to life imprisonment. Sheila pled not guilty but was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment. Rachel pled guilty and received a reduced sentence of 30 years. Now, apparently, Rachel actually got married in prison in the women's only facility, and the reason I'm telling you this is because one of those secrets that Skylar possibly held was Rachel and Sheila's romantic relationship. It was speculated that the primary reason that Sheila and Rachel agreed to take their friend's life was because they believed they wouldn't be accepted if they were exposed. However, neither one has confirmed this.
Why does Wi-Fi only seem to work in this room?
You need Verizon Home Internet.
How did...
Oh, I let myself in.
This happened during my sophomore year in high school. I remember that I took an elective class that was called Outdoor Activities. It was an easy and fun gym class where we went outside and did stuff. We had a different subject every week, and they all revolved around the outdoors. One week we learned how to fish, and another we played tennis. For this week in particular, we were going hiking. I remember that we hiked on a path near school grounds earlier in the week. Then, later in the week, we took a field trip to a state park that was nearby. The park was pretty large, with many different trails on it. Our teacher, Mr. Salieri, was leading the way for the rest of us. The class was not that big, and had maybe between 15 and 20 people in it. So on the day of the field trip, we all boarded a school bus and took the maybe 20-minute ride there. The class period was going to go longer than usual, and we would be able to skip the first part of our next class. That's something that I was not mad about, as my next class period was math. So after we got to the park, we all got off and I saw what the place looked like. There was a lake there and a spot for picnics and stuff. Then there was a bunch of paths and a huge wooded area. Mr. Salieri started down one of the paths into the woods. He walked pretty fast and made it clear to us that we were there to hike and not to mess around. So we started walking, and I was walking with one of my good friends, Marcus, who also happened to be in the class. Marcus and I were walking at the very end of the line. We were admittedly moving at a slower pace than everybody else. I remember that we were talking about girls and got really immersed in the conversation. There was a girl that I liked that he was friends with, and he was giving me advice and that sort of stuff. We were not really paying attention to the rest of the class very well. The path we were on was surrounded by woods and had a lot of twists and turns. Because of this, it didn't take long for us to not be able to even see the other people in front of us. We didn't really care though, and knew that we could catch back up at any time. As we continued our conversation, at some point, I remember we suddenly heard a noise to the left. It was the sound of twigs breaking and some leaves moving. Something was moving in the woods on the left side. We both automatically assumed that it was an animal at first, but it would have been a large one. I remember Marcus saying, "Did you hear that?" We guessed that it was probably a deer. We paused our conversation and started to look. You couldn't really see anything that far in the woods though. It was really dense. I sort of saw some branches and leaves moving, but couldn't tell what had caused it. We were curious, so we decided to take a couple of steps into the woods. I remember that I sort of made my own path by just stepping through the dense brush. After a few steps into the woods, I could see a little bit better. We kept walking closer and made it in over 10 feet probably. Then I saw some sudden movement up ahead in the woods. I realized that there was a man there. It was not an animal after all. But what was a guy doing right here in the middle of the woods? He was wearing a brown jacket, and I could see that he had a messy beard and longer messy hair. He seemed to turn and look at us. That's when we decided to go back to the path. Neither of us said anything and started making our way back in the direction that we had come from. I was a little bit creeped out by seeing a guy just standing in the middle of the dense woods off the path. After we made it back, we continued to walk in the direction that our class had gone. By now, though, they were way ahead of us. We were not walking for that long, though, before we heard more movement in the woods, but closer. It seemed as though the man in the woods was now making his way to the path that we were on. We ignored it and just kept walking. We started to continue our conversation, but then noticed that the man was actually on the path now, and he also seemed to be walking behind us the same way that we were going. He was maybe 40 or 50 feet behind. I glanced back and saw him just walking after us. It was a little weird, so Marcus and I decided to walk a little bit faster. We actually wanted to catch up with the rest of the group now. After a couple of minutes of walking at a fast pace, we could still hear the man. I looked back, and he was now walking fast behind us at about the same pace that we were going, and he was probably around the same distance back. We were so far behind the class that we still couldn't even hear the rest of them. But then we came up to a place where the path went 3 ways, left, right, and straight. We had no idea where everybody else went, so we chose to go to the left. After walking down that way a little, we realized that the man had gone that way as well with us. At this point, Marcus and I decided to start jogging. We both played sports and were athletic guys. We would be able to run for a while. There was no way that this guy following us from the woods was going to run too. But we were wrong. He actually started to jog after us. Now there was no question that he was chasing us for some reason. Marcus and I went faster, desperately trying to get away from this guy. The more that we ran, the more that we realized that we had gone the wrong way though. We would have almost certainly caught up to the group by now if they had gone in this direction. But we couldn't go back, or else we would run into the man that was chasing us. We just kept running, and then decided to go off the path. There was an area where the woods wasn't as thick. Marcus and I both cut off the path and then entered the woods. We continued to run, sprinting through the forest and getting hit by various tree branches. The man ran after us, also leaving the path and entering the woods again. After we ran through the woods for what felt like a long time, we saw another path. We ran to the path and then started jogging down that as well. The man was still behind us. We jogged on that path for only about a minute before leaving and going off of it and into the woods again. We really had no plan and were just winging it. After running through the woods for a while longer, by some miracle, we made it to this opening with another picnic area. There were some tables, another parking lot, and actually people around. We were so glad to see them and emerged from the woods and walked towards them. They had some strange looks on their faces to see us running out of the woods out of nowhere. But when we looked back, the man hadn't followed us out. He was still in the woods. We walked through the picnic area, and then there was another path on the other side that sort of went by. Marcus and I didn't really know where to go, so we just walked along the path. We headed down it for a while, and about a minute into this path, we heard voices of people up ahead. Then we saw Mr. Salieri and the rest of the class approaching us. They looked surprised to see us, but we were extremely happy to see them. Mr. Salieri asked us where on earth we had come from. We told him the story, and he wasn't mad at us or anything. In fact, he found it funny and was giving us a hard time about it for the rest of the class. I'm really glad that we were able to get away from the guy. I'm not sure who he was or what he wanted from us. Maybe he was mad that we disturbed him while he was walking in the woods. I really don't know, but I think it's so crazy that he was literally running after us. That was my most memorable field trip.
Introducing Milo's Rewards, the new way to unlock savings from the palm of your hand. With every purchase, all loyalty members earn points toward Milo's money. Plus, you get free gifts and free shipping. The all-new Milo's Rewards.
Back when I was in high school, we took a field trip to a museum in the city. I was a freshman at the time. I lived just outside of the city, and our school was close by. It wasn't that far of a field trip, but it was still exciting anytime we could get out of our normal class routine. It was an art museum, and I know that we went there for the art class that I was in. We left school shortly after it started and took a bus into the city. We then got dropped off in front of the art museum. When we went inside, we had a brief tour from a tour guide, and then we were allowed to walk around the museum freely. I was still kind of new to the school at this time, and had transferred at the start of the year. Most of the kids were nice, but I was kind of walking around the museum by myself. I wasn't really hanging out with anyone specifically that day in particular. I remember that about an hour into the field trip, I was in one of the rooms of the museum. There were not that many other people around, and the room was mostly dark. I was just looking at some paintings when suddenly I felt a tap on my shoulder. I looked and saw there was a man standing there. He looked to be in his 30s or 40s, and I did not know who he was. After getting my attention, he said hi to me. I was confused as to why he was talking to me. He clearly didn't work at the museum, and he wasn't part of my class. The guy asked me my name, and then asked me what I was doing here. I remember him saying something like, "Did you skip school today?" I told him no, I was literally here on a field trip. He looked around and then saw the few other people in my class around. Then he started asking me more questions about myself. I was kind of creeped out by the guy. I tried to end the conversation multiple times, but he would just keep talking to me. Finally, I just said that I had to go, and I walked away. He didn't follow me or anything, and I thought that I had gotten rid of him. But sometime later, when I was in a completely different spot, he approached me again. It was basically the same as the time before. He just came up and said hi, and then tried talking to me some more. I wanted to walk away from him, but he kept asking me questions and stuff. Finally, once more, I said that I had to go, and I walked away. This time, though, he kind of started to follow me. He was walking after me until I made it back near my teacher. Then he stayed a distance away. So for the rest of the entire field trip, I was sure to stay sort of near the teacher. He didn't come up and harass me for the rest of the time. But shortly before leaving, I did notice him again. He was standing like 50 feet away and just staring at me. It was so creepy that I had to look away. I was glad when we were finally leaving the museum. After we left, we got back to the school and finished the school day. I later went home. That night, I went on Instagram and saw that I had a new follower. When I looked, it was the guy from the museum. He wasn't using an actual name. I can't remember what his username was though, but the picture was certainly of him. He then sent me a direct message saying hi. I didn't waste any time and I blocked the account. Then I made my account private. What really creeps me out is that I never told him my last name, and my first name is pretty common, so I don't know how he found my Instagram. Luckily, I never saw him or heard from him again after that. This happened back when I was probably about 10 years old. I remembered that the school that I went to was pretty large, and I had a lot of friends there. One day, though, we went on a field trip to the city to watch some dance thing. It was in a large theater, and there was a dance performance on the stage. Our school was taking several classes there, and probably over 100 kids. I rode one of the buses with my class to the city, and then we were all dropped off. We went inside the theater, which had a very old and nice-looking lobby. Then we went into the auditorium, and our teachers told us where we were all supposed to sit. I sat next to my best friend Jake, and we were on the first level in the far back row and on the end. Pretty soon, the dance stuff started. We watched it for what felt like a really long time. I'm not sure exactly how long it was, maybe an hour. Soon though, Jake and I got kind of bored. In fact, I was trying to keep myself from falling asleep. I guess I just wasn't a huge fan of the ballet. Jake suggested that we could just get up and walk around for a bit. This seemed like a good idea to me because of where we were sitting. We were really close to the door and wouldn't disturb anybody by getting up. In fact, most people probably wouldn't even notice. So Jake and I got up and left the auditorium to go back into the lobby area. It was empty now, and we walked out of the lobby down a hallway. This had bathrooms and some benches and stuff. We walked through there, and then there was a staircase going up. We were curious, so we went up the stairs. They led to the second level, which was basically another lobby. That would go to the seats in the upper deck. We explored a little bit more, and there were some other cool rooms. There was a small area that had lots of pictures of performances that had taken place in the theater. There were also other hallways and rooms as well. A few people were around, but not very many. It was more interesting for us to walk around and explore than it was to watch the ballet. As we were walking around, I remember noticing this woman on the second floor. I just remember that she had shorter blonde hair and was wearing a winter hat. As we were walking around, she seemed to follow us. At first, I thought maybe she worked for the theater and we weren't supposed to be walking around over there. I knew that she didn't work for our school. Jake and I decided after a while to go back down to the first floor. When we did, the woman walked a ways behind us, and she went down to the first floor as well, but she never approached us to say anything. I remember that Jake went to use the bathroom on the first floor, and I stood around the lobby waiting. The woman was just kind of standing around in the corner and looking towards me. I didn't want to ask her what she was doing, but it seemed kind of strange. After Jake got out of the bathroom, he came over to me and sat down on a bench in the lobby. That way we could talk and didn't have to be quiet. I noticed that the woman sat down in the corner of the room and was just kind of looking around. Jake and I talked to each other for probably an hour or so, and then figured that we should get back to the performance. When we got up, the woman was still sitting there in the corner. Now, at this point, I was still assuming that she worked for the theater in some way, and she maybe thought that Jake and I were up to no good. I did think that it was weird though. We went back to our seats, and I don't think anybody even noticed that we were gone for so long. We watched the rest of the performance, which went for about 2 or 3 more hours. When we got up and left with everybody else, the lobby soon became very crowded. We each had to meet with our classes and take attendance before leaving. When we were out in the lobby, I noticed the woman looking at me from a distance. I thought that this was really weird. Soon we left the theater and boarded our bus, which was parked out front. There were maybe 5 buses in total, all parallel parked on the side of the street. After getting on the bus, we didn't leave for at least another 10 minutes. Of course, the teachers had to make sure that everybody was there and stuff over and over again. At first, right after getting to my seat on the bus, I saw the woman walking now outside. I figured that was that and I wouldn't see her again. But then when we were about